Hello guys, and I'm gonna be spending the night under a blanket. Yeah, this is mine. This is where I'm gonna be staying. I think you can see that, but we're gonna be staying here. And we're gonna cut some into some entertainment stuff. Hello guys, and we're gonna be reacting now. And I'm not in the blanket anymore. I'm gonna go in the blanket. Just wait. Just wait, alright? Okay, I'm in the blanket.
In my most recent video, I took the original Super Mario Bros. Game and turned it into a new 3D version in honor of the game's 35th anniversary, and people seem to really like it. I think what made it so special is that for the first time I made a game where all the assets were made by me, instead of relying on an external source like Sketchfab. So I decided to do the same thing again, in honor of another franchise celebrating their 35th anniversary this year, The Legend of Zelda. And in my last video, I made a joke about getting to 100,000 subscribers, since at the time I was only at 50,000, and now somehow I'm well past 200,000, one of whom is Ludwig. I guess the only thing left to do at this point is to head towards 1 million, hopefully by the end of the year, so subscribe. Usually when remaking a game, I tend to only create the character and then the first level of the game, and then create a video to go along those two things. I don't know what happened this time, but apparently I decided it was a good idea to create the entire overworld from the original Legend of Zelda. I think you might be starting to see why it's been so long since my last upload. I also decided to create all of the overworld enemies and the items, all in the same voxel art style that I learned last time. But let's not get ahead of ourselves yet. The first thing I wanted to do was get a working character model for Link. To get started, I based a model for Link off of the 8-bit amiibo that Nintendo released a couple of years ago. However, everything in the game has two distinct animation frames, so I needed to alter that model to create the second frame. Then I imported both models into Unity and made a basic walk cycle using these two models, but it looked kinda bad. I decided to create a third animation frame to pass through both of the other two frames by keeping his legs in the middle. Throwing this into the walk cycle makes it look much better. The next thing I wanted to do was make a model for swinging the sword. For this, Link swings his shield out to the side and thrusts his sword forward. His mouth also opens up slightly, and you can almost hear his famous shouting in the background. With these models finished, I was done working on Link for now, and then decided to start working on modeling the overworld, which is where I spent most of my time. I found a picture of the overworld which included everything I needed to know, including enemy spawns, item locations, and hidden entrances. With this I could get started. First I made a giant plane and scaled it up to match the dimensions of the map. Then I added a material to match the color of the ground from the game. The next thing I started doing was adding all of the rock structures. For this I used ProBuilder to trace the outline of the shape, and then I scaled it up to make it 3D. Then I went ahead and created a texture for the green rocks and applied it to a material that I could use on the new 3D shape. With the material applied, I could better visualize what it would look like, so I decided to make the structure 2 blocks tall based on the height of the texture. I repeated the same tracing process for the next few surrounding structures, and scaled them all up to be about the same height. Then I placed Link into the scene and tried getting a feel for it by walking around. It felt really claustrophobic as everything seemed either too narrow or too tall. To get around this, I scaled it down to be 1 layer tall again, but then I shrunk the top face of the structure and then scaled that up to be 1 layer tall. Doing this, I could keep the same height without everything feeling claustrophobic. At this point, I decided to zoom out and appreciate all the work that I've done so far, and oh, I've barely even done anything. I continued on by finishing the last of the green structures. The only tricky part was over here by the entrance to level 2. There's a ladder here that brings you up to a higher elevation. I created a texture for the ladder, but I didn't really know what to do after that. If I made a ladder that is perpendicular to the ground, that would mean that this area would be directly above this area, but the map shows that it's set further back. So instead of making it a ladder, I decided to make it a staircase. Luckily, ProBuilder has a feature to automatically build staircases, but I decided not to use this for 2 reasons. The first reason is that it displays the texture weirdly, and the second is that the camera will jitter when walking up or down the staircase. So instead I decided to just make it a flat plane and put it at an angle. With all the green structures done, I decided to start creating these little green bushes. First I created the model in Magic Voxel, and then I imported it over into Unity and scaled it up to match the dimensions with the dimensions of the map. Now, if you remember, I made a joke last time about how much copying and pasting the developers of Super Mario Bros. Did, and yes, I realized that it was to keep the game files extremely small, but what those guys did is nothing compared to the amount of copying and pasting the developers of The Legend of Zelda did. The entire time I was placing around these bushes, I had my fingers glued to the Control-C and V keys. By the end of it, my pinky was hurting from holding down the Control key for so long, and I'm actually surprised I finished it without seeing sticky keys pop up even once. Oh, and by the way, if you were curious, there are apparently over 1,800 of these green bushes. Now if we zoom out and look at the whole map, it actually looks like I've made a good amount of progress. So I decided to do the exact same again, but for the brown bushes this time. Luckily during all of this, I could select an entire group of bushes and copy and paste the entire group, so I didn't have to actually copy and paste thousands of bushes one by one. After finishing all the bushes, I decided to start modeling these rock statues. I don't know what they're actually supposed to be, but to me they look like snails, so I'd called them snail rocks. And I don't know what's wrong with my brain, but once again, I made a model that looks good from every angle except for the front, and it actually looks almost identical to the front-facing Koopa that I made previously. And now I decided that I wanted to start creating the water. I could have just placed a flat texture on top of the ground and called it water, but that would be boring. So I grabbed the water share that I've used in previous videos and used it again here with some textures that I made for the water. In order for the share to work properly, the object it's used on has to have multiple faces to make it look like the water's moving. If you use it on just one giant face, it makes it look really bad, which is probably why it didn't look all that great when I used it in the Sonic video. So I used ProBuilder to make a new shape and model it along the water. I don't really know much about 3D modeling, but I'm pretty sure having a lot of faces like this is generally bad, but it doesn't lag in my game, so oh well. Now I wanted to make it look like the water level was below the beach, but the problem is that I used one giant plane to create the entire map. Apparently there's some experimental feature in ProBuilder that you can use to cut holes in faces, but when I tried to use it, Unity just crashed. So I tried it again, and it crashed again. I kept trying until finally it worked one time when I used a smaller cube, but after that it kept crashing, so I decided, alright, the water's just going on top of the beach now. And you know, technically I'm not wrong. I continued modeling the rest of the ponds in the lake, and one of the rivers. I decided to save this river until later, and you'll see why when I get back to it. At this point, I decided to start modeling the brown rock structures that cover pretty much the rest of the map. The reason why I held off on doing this is because of all the ladders that change the elevation everywhere. There are some inconsistencies with the logic of the ladders. For example, down here there's a ladder that goes up, which should mean that everything from here on should be higher than the rest of the map. But continuing on from there, there's one more ladder that leads up to another point that's even higher. But right next to that is one ladder that returns back to the ground level. It doesn't make sense for two ladders to reach the same height as just one ladder, so that must mean that somewhere along the way the ground itself went down. There were a few places where I had to put ramps to change the elevation to match up with the ladders. The first spot is right here where I made a downwards ramp, and one is over here alongside the river, which is why I decided to hold off on that river. From here on, I just did a bunch of modeling to create the brown rock structures, and I gradually made the height increase as you go back, because I'm pretty sure this area is supposed to be Death Mountain. I also finished modeling the river, all the way up to the top, past the waterfall where there's a little pond. It's also worth noting that there's a secret in the top right corner of the map. In the original game, there's actually an invisible path leading up to a higher area, so I replicated this by turning off collisions on one of the blocks so that you can reach the ladder. Now if you zoom out, it looks like pretty much everything on the map is complete, except for two areas with white rock structures over here and over here. I made one more texture for the white rock and quickly made the outlines for these last two 3D models. There are also two rows of white bushes, so I had to go and change to a new color palette for the bushes to create a new material. And then, since this is a graveyard, I had to make new models for the gravestones. I also had to create a new material to make the ground into a gray color in these areas. Finishing touches. Other than the bushes and the snail rocks, there are various other props that fill up the world. One of which is these suits of armor, that when touched actually turn into an enemy, but we'll get to that part later. At first I thought I could just use the model that I made for Link and swap on a new head to create the suit of armor, but it actually ended up being a bit more involved since the armor is actually thicker than Link is. Then I started making a model for the trees, and I realized while modeling the trees that the big tree dungeon entrances reused the same models except with a face in between, and it was a pretty similar process for making the other dungeon entrances and the obelisks. Then I placed these models in various places on the map, and turned off collisions on the openings so that Link could walk through them. I also realized that there are actually a few different versions of the dungeon entrances, one that has one eye, one that has two eyes, and one really large one that repeats the one eye texture twice. The final piece of the map that I had left was this desert area here that uses different textures for the floor, and with that, the entire map was now finished. I decided the world that I recreated, but then I quickly got back to work after realizing that this is basically just a glorified walking simulator.
โอ้โหมีไปเลยมาเรียนตัวอะไรเนี่ยเปปเปอร์ตัวอะไรอ่ะหล่อนคือใคร SNR ของฉันเธอคือใครกันในเกมก็จะมีระบบมากมายทุกคนอย่าลืมเข้าไปกดไปลองเล่นกันนะทุกคนถ้าคุณไม่โหลดตอนนี้คุณจะไม่ได้ของแถมแล้วนะ
At this point, I wanted to start adding the enemies, so I took.
These are some shameless cartoon rip-offs, part 1.
รักแม่ครับ รักแม่ครับ
Starting off, we've got the Chinese cartoon Miracle Star, which is an obvious Amazing World of Gumball ripoff. Just look at the main cast, the backgrounds, even some episodes are shot-for-shot recreations. It was so blatant that Gumball actually featured the characters in an episode titled The Copycats, in which they dealt with plagiarism really well, getting their message across while not seeming bitter. Next, we've got a 3-in-1, the Little Panda Fighter, Ratatouille, and How to Ratatouille Your Panda, with the former two being interesting Brazilian ripoffs of Kung Fu Panda and Ratatouille respectively, which the Amazing World of Gumball parodied in the episode The Treasure, through How to Ratatouille Your Panda, once again making fun of mockbusters and plagiarism as a whole.
Okay, you asked for it.
Mario transforms into Creeper Mario, which when you press the R button, well... Once you consume the time travel power-up, a trail starts to spawn behind you wherever you go. When you press L on your control...
So I'm gonna go to bed now. Yeah, it's getting kinda late. Bye. Hello guys, just went out of the blanket. I was sleeping in the blanket. Yeah, this just came out. Right now.